It's no secret that the southern resident orca population in the Salish Sea is critically endangered, and it faces many challenges that could lead its population to extinction. An overwhelming challenge is the population's reliance on Chinook salmon as their primary prey, as the salmon's population is also declining. There is also a new question that was recently answered that could identify another challenge. Is the energy storage of fats in Chinook salmon equal among Chinook salmon? Researchers from the University of British Columbia tested the fat content in Chinook salmon in the spring and fall populations to find out if their lipid content was the same. We are going to talk about the results, which could help decipher management decisions for Chinook salmon and orcas in the future. On this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast, let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of How to Protect the Ocean. I am your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. And today we're going to be talking about orcas of the southern resident orca population. Now this population is critically endangered for a number of reasons. We'll go through it briefly in this episode because I think it's really important to understand what's been happening. They used to have about 150 individuals in the population. In the 1970s, there was a mass catch of orcas for the captive marine mammal sort of industry in marine theme parks, and a lot of them were about 62 were taken. And since then, the population has slowly declined to about 71, 72 individuals, maybe even less than that, depending on how the population does year over year in terms of breeding and successfully rearing other orcas, of course. A lot of them get born, but unfortunately they die. And the reason why the population hasn't done so well is a number of things. They haven't been able to recoup from the loss of the 62 individuals that got caught in the marine theme park sort of industry. And that's tough for them. You know, they're a long-lived species. They live to about 70 to 80 years old in the wild. And so it's difficult for them to just kind of, just bring in new young calves and to adulthood when they have to make up so many individuals. And the other major thing is the southern resident orca population is highly dependent on Chinook salmon. We know this because they don't eat anything else. Now, it's kind of interesting when we talk about the resident population, the resident orca population, because there's the southern resident orca population, and then there's the north resident orca population, but then there's also a transient population. Now, the transient population eats whatever they want. They'll eat marine mammals, they'll eat sharks, they'll eat squid, they'll eat mollusks, they'll eat anything really that they want, including Chinook salmon. The southern resident orca population, on the other hand, will only eat Chinook salmon. And if Chinook salmon aren't doing well, the orca population isn't going to do well. And that's exactly what's happening. For a long time, since the early 80s, the Chinook salmon population has been slowly declining. And a lot of that is due to climate change. Some of it is due to dams that have been built along river systems along the coast of BC and even Washington state. And the reason why that has happened is because when Chinook salmon go to breed, they get bred and they basically hatch from their eggs in river systems, and then they go out into the ocean for about 2 to 3 years, and then they come back from the ocean to breed again and finish off their life cycle. Well, they need river systems to go into to breed, so they're a freshwater species breeder, and so that they need to go into those river systems. Now, if they've been blocked because of hydro dams or other reasons, then they can't get up river, and they can't go through, and they can't breed. So a lot of those river systems have been abandoned with new Chinook salmon, hence the Chinook salmon population has gone down. Other things that could affect the Chinook salmon, aquaculture industry, the open pen aquaculture industry near the Fraser River could also have some sort of negative impact on the population. That is contested, that is controversial right now, so I'm not going to get into it. But if you watch the Salmon People podcast, or listen, to the Salmon People podcast, you can find out everything that's going on in probably about 10 episodes or so. It's a fantastic series. I highly recommend it. I'll put a link in the description below, or I'll put a link in the show notes if you're listening to the audio podcast and not on YouTube. Regardless, the aquaculture industry could affect the population. Dams could affect the population in blocking off physical reproduction sites for the area. And then just overfishing, mismanagement, water pollution, climate change, all those things vary in those factors, okay? Something that has been really interesting lately is researchers have noticed that the orca population has actually been slimming down. And normally you think, hey, you know what? Whales are slimming down. That's a good thing. Everybody wants to be slim. Everybody wants to be trim. You want to be lean. That's not good for whales. Whales need their fat for a number of reasons, for energy deposits, to store energy, as well as, they can go for a long time without food these days because of the declining population. So they're going to need fat for energy storage. Now, like I said, its main source of Chinook salmon is declining, and certain Chinook are declining more than others. So there's a spring and a fall sort of population that come back. The spring population is actually doing worse off. It's lower than the fall population. And spawning in Chinook sites spawning of Chinook salmon differ in that the populations in certain populations will breed near the coastlines. Other populations will breed up in the mountains. So that's always interesting. Now, the question here is, because the orca population is leaning down or trimming down and they're losing their fats, the question here is, what's happening with the Chinook salmon quality and not the quantity? We know what's happening with the quantity. They're losing quantity, but what's happening with the quality of the fish? Do all Chinook salmon have the same fat deposits? Do they have the same energy storage? Because fat is really important for the orcas. They need to ingest fat as much as possible to gain fat. And researchers are wondering at UBC whether they can actually detect whether the spring population has more fat or less fat than the fall population. It's a really interesting way of thinking about how these animals are eating and when they're eating and how often they need to eat and how much fat they need to get in their diet. So we kind of know that, but there's an instrument now that measures fat content. It's called the fat meter, and it's used by the aquaculture industry to test the amount of fat and fat richness of each salmon, Chinook salmon, or the population of salmon within the open pen. So the researchers from the University of British Columbia use the fat meter to look for fat content comparison between the Chinook salmon in the spring and the Chinook salmon in the fall. The fat meter revealed that the significant difference of fat content between the spring and fall populations. The spring was actually fattier, which is nice. So the orcas only had to eat 245,000 individual Chinook salmon versus 325,000 Chinook salmon in the fall to match the energy requirement to kind of just maintain what they have. The fact that they need less spring is good, but and they'll get more in the fall. They need more in the fall, but in the spring, it's okay to actually have these spring salmon. However, as I mentioned earlier, the spring salmon or the spring Chinook salmon is actually declining, and they're becoming critical as well, if not already critical. So now the orcas want the spring Chinook salmon as they have higher fat content, but now they have to find more Chinook salmon in the spring. That means they have to dispense more energy to find the Chinook salmon. So it's making it harder. So they're losing more fat by using more energy to find the fish that gives them more fat and more energy. It's really a tough situation for the southern resident orca population right now, in that they're declining because there's not enough Chinook salmon overall. The spring salmon is decreasing, but they have the higher fattier content. So the orcas need more of that, but they can't get it because there's not enough of those Chinook salmon in the spring. Really, the solution here is nothing can be done at this point that it will be a short-term gain other than looking at the management of the spring Chinook salmon. Looking at the management of overall Chinook salmon, but really focusing in on the spring Chinook salmon because that has the higher fattier content. And so the orcas need to have more spring Chinook salmon. Now, more research on fat content and how it's affected by different elevations. As I mentioned before, Chinook salmon can spawn along the coastlines, but they can also spawn upriver on higher elevation. So wondering how elevation actually affects fat content is going to be really important. And then the other thing that needs to be researched more is how the ocean affects the accumulation of fat content in Chinook salmon. That's going to be a really important question here because we're wondering what's happening with the Chinook salmon when they come back from the ocean. Is it a climate change thing? Are they getting predated upon by certain animals while they're out there? What's happening with those fish? What's happening with the accumulation of that fat content while they're out in the ocean so that when they come back towards the shore and they come back in the path of the southern resident orca population, where are these fish and what's happening and how can we get more to return? So that's really the solution that needs to be done, is more research. And unfortunately, there's no real short-term solution right now other than regular fish management. Chinook salmon are caught by fishermen. They need to be regulated, heavily regulated with quota systems, which they already are. I don't know how that's doing. I'll have to look in, dig in deeper to find out how these Chinook salmon are managed from a fishing standpoint, considering especially the critically endangered status, if they're even fished, if they're even allowed to be fished from the wild populations. Obviously, aquaculture plays a role in this and the negative impacts, and a lot of development along the coastlines affect them as well. So we're going to have to find out, how this sort of balance needs to be set, how the management needs to be set for Chinook salmon in general, but then focusing on the spring population as they have the higher fat content. I would love to hear what you think of this. I think it's a really important study, something that sheds light onto what's been happening in the ocean, what's been happening to Chinook salmon, and why we're getting less fattier fish instead of more fattier fish. So I would love to hear what you think about it. If you're watching this on YouTube, leave a comment below. If you're listening to this on your favorite podcast app and you're listening to the audio version, hit me up on Instagram at howtoprotecttheocean, at howtoprotecttheocean. DM me. I would love to hear from you. Or go to speakupforblue.com/contact and just leave me a message. Just fill in the form. It'll go right to my email. I would love to hear from you. What you think of this? How do you think it should be managed? Do you have more information on Chinook salmon in the British Columbia area? I would love to hear from you. That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for joining us on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.